us today. Sorry. And you are here to talk to us today about the 1848 revolutions and its effect on Marx and Engels.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Well, thank you for joining us. And yeah, you should be a co-host. So if you want to share a presentation, you can. Um, However you want to proceed.
Okay. I'm not sure that I will have audio-visual aids with this, uh, because the 1848 revolution, unlike other revolutions, has not been very much represented, for instance, in the history of art. There is one painting in particular that I might share with you guys, depending on how we go. But other than that, the famous painting that people know from Eugene Delacroix, Liberty Leading the People, is from the 1830 Revolution, the July Revolution in France. That has a place in the popular culture. And that was the preceding revolution before the 1848 revolution in France. So let me give some background. Let me present the context for 1848. So there are two contexts to consider with respect to 1848. One is political history, the history of modern revolutions. So the history of revolutions from 1776, from the American Revolution through the 1789 French Revolution. And then I mentioned the July 1830 revolution in France. So there was a kind of a sequence of modern revolutions. That is one historical background for us to consider. The other is more what we would consider economic history, and that's the Industrial Revolution, which is conventionally dated from circa 1750 to about 1850. That's the first Industrial Revolution. The second Industrial Revolution is usually dated from 1870 to World War I, 1914. And really, it's the combination of these two things, the Industrial Revolution and the history of modern political revolutions, that's informing Marx and Engels when they are writing for the first time in their 20s. These are young people. Their writings in the 1840s, leading up to, of course, their famous jointly written Communist Manifesto, which was written in late 1847 and published in early 1848, before the February Revolution in France in 1848. So I mentioned the 1840s, when Marx and Engels came to consciousness as young adult people in their 20s. So the 1840s, the way that I like to put it, are really crucial for modern history more generally, but also for the history of Marxism. I like to say that Marx would not have been Marx if he had not come to consciousness as a young man in the 1840s. So I mentioned political and economic history. There's also, we could think about this in terms of the subjective and the objective phenomena of the time of the 1840s. So objectively, the 1840s are known as the Hungry 1840s, the Hungry 40s. It's the first worldwide global depression after the Industrial Revolution. So there had been commercial crises previously. Probably the most famous is the tulip craze in the 17th century. But this is the first major commercial crisis and global economic downturn, global depression after the Industrial Revolution. So objectively, that's what's going on in terms of economic and social conditions. But subjectively, you have in the early 1800s and the early 19th century, the emergence of the modern workers' movement for socialism. So you have the birth of socialism as a movement during the time of the French Revolution, most famously with Gracchus Babeuf in the period of the Directory, in the period after the fall of the Jacobins, who has the conspiracy of equals. He's considered one of the originators of socialism. And socialism is a modern movement. Communism, so I mentioned the Communist Manifesto. Communism is more of an ancient ideal that actually comes out of religious traditions. In other words, people living together, sharing things in common, usually with a kind of a vow of poverty, right? That's what we associate with communism. Socialism, however, is a very modern phenomenon, and it originates from this era of modern revolutions, and it also originates in this era of the Industrial Revolution and the industrial working class, the emergence of the proletariat as a new kind of laboring class in history. The socialist movement up to the 1840s had gone through various developments and also had different tendencies to it. So you've probably heard of the utopian socialists. So Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, Robert Owen, these are famous utopian socialists, but there are others. So utopian socialism comes out of a sense of not just economic, but social and political possibilities coming out of industrial society, industrial production. But there are other different tendencies in the history of socialism as well. Chartism in England as an industrial workers movement for labor reform, for reform of labor conditions, and also for universal suffrage without a property requirement. So we usually know from the history of Marxism, Marxism is described by Marx and Engels themselves, but also by later Marxists, as this coming together of three different traditions. One is British political economy. So starting with Adam Smith and followed by others like Ricardo, but also the utilitarians. British political economy, German philosophy. What's meant by this is German idealist philosophy, modern idealist philosophy, basically the tradition from Kant to Hegel. And then French socialism, because socialism as a movement was something that, like I said, originated out of the French Revolution and had specific traditions there. Even socialists outside of France were very much influenced by this French socialist tradition. Again, in the aftermath of the French Revolution and the effects that the French Revolution had throughout Europe. So when I mention the French Revolution, I'm really talking about the full cycle of the French Revolution, 1789 to 1815, to the second defeat of Napoleon, that whole cycle. Because again, it's in the midst of that we get a socialist movement emerging. So when Marx and Engels arrive on the scene in the 1840s as young men, the Industrial Revolution had already been going on for quite some time, nearly a century, and the socialist movement had already been going on for quite some time, 40 or 50 years. They are not the originators of socialism or a kind of modern communist politics. They're not the inventors of a modern proletarian workers movement for socialism, but rather they are observing this phenomenon. I mentioned it's a subjective phenomenon. We could put it in the realm of political phenomena, a subjective phenomenon of modern political ideology, a modern political movement with a vision of present society and with demands on that society, but also really a goal towards a transformed society. And again, the objective phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution, and Marx and Engels, of course, are not the first to notice that objective phenomenon, the transformation of society involved in the Industrial Revolution. So they are, in this respect, synthesizing French socialism as a political subjective phenomenon, British political economy as registering the effects on society, because political economy is really a kind of a social theory. It's not economics. It's really a vision of what constitutes society and how society reproduces itself. Out of utopian socialism, out of the Saint-Simonian movement, we get Auguste Comte, who coins the phrase social relations. So when you read in Marx about social relations, that's not an original concept of Marx's. That's again coming out of the French socialist movement. And social relations doesn't just refer to economic relations. It doesn't even just refer to relations between people, but also refers to the relations that people have not only with each other, but with nature and also with themselves. So it's a interpersonal relation. It's also a relation with nature and a self relation. Right. So the idea that modern society is a new kind of set of social relations, and that the Industrial Revolution presents certain challenges to those social relations. It's Industrial Revolution, industrial capitalism, the modern world in the 1800s is actually a crisis of social relations. It's a crisis of how we relate to each other, how we relate to nature, and how we relate to ourselves. And that had been recognized widely. Again, in French socialism, also in British political economy, in the tradition of British political economy, and also in the tradition of German idealist philosophy. So you might know that Marx and Engels were young Hegelians. So they're coming out of the Hegelian philosophical movement. They're the youngest of the young Hegelians. And there was a crisis in Hegelian philosophy that was taking place already in the 1830s and 1840s. A lot of the young Hegelians actually identified themselves as communists and socialists. So they were political radicals as well as philosophical radicals. So there was already a connection within Hegelian philosophy, within the tradition, the legacy of Hegel's philosophy. There was already a political identification with the socialist and communist movement before Marx and Engels arrive on the scene, right? So all of this is already in train. And one of the first things that Engels wrote that caught Marx's attention and really esteemed him in Marx's eyes was a book on the condition of the working class in England. And it was written out of his experience going to manage a factory that was owned by his family. So Marx and Engels are part of the, or excuse me, from the western part of Germany, the Rhineland. They're Rhenish, they're from the Rhineland. They're from the part of Germany that was most bourgeois, most modern, most industrialized, and also most politically affected by the French Revolution. So, for instance, in Marx's own household, growing up, his family sang French revolutionary songs. Right. So these were radical, democratic, liberal-minded people as very young people, you know, as teenagers, as schoolboys. So, however, even though it was affected by the Industrial Revolution, even though there was some industrialization in the western part of Germany, it was not as proletarianized, not as dramatically affected by the Industrial Revolution as England was. So when Engels went to England, he was shocked at the conditions in Manchester, which was a center of industrial production. Shocked by the slums, the slum conditions of the proletarianized working class. And his book is really a kind of a muckraking kind of journalistic expose, as well as a speculation on the social and historical significance of this phenomenon, of these conditions brought about by the industrialization of society. I'll say something else about, I mentioned the Industrial Revolution and also the industrialization of society. That's how Marxists define, starting with Marx and Engels themselves, that's how Marxists define capitalism. They define it as the society of the Industrial Revolution. So famously, they describe capitalism as the contradiction of the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production. So that contradiction really happens with the Industrial Revolution, although both the bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production have ancient roots. They each have a deeper history, going all the way back actually to classical antiquity. So that's why when you read Marx and Engels, they will sometimes talk about the industrial forces of production developing over hundreds and even thousands of years. They will even talk about the bourgeois social relations developing over hundreds and thousands of years. So classical antiquity, ancient Athens, ancient Rome, they will refer to as bourgeois in character. And they will also talk about the ancient Enlightenment and ancient science as the beginnings of the industrial forces of production. So they both have very ancient histories, but this specific contradiction that characterizes capitalism is something that's much more recent, much more modern in their view. So I mentioned that because there are other ways of describing capitalism. For example, Max Weber, German sociologist, German social theorist, he talks about ancient or traditional capitalism versus modern capitalism. And what he has in mind there is simply any kind of profiteering, any kind of commercial activity done for profit, he just calls capitalism. That's the way we tend to colloquially talk about capitalism. And then he'll talk about modern capitalism, meaning the capitalism that you get that's new and different in the modern bourgeois era, meaning with the Renaissance and especially the Protestant Reformation, right? The revolutionizing of Christianity in the bourgeois modern era. So that would be modern capitalism. That's a very different way of describing capitalism than the way Marx and Engels do. So in many respects, in Marx and Engels' view, capitalism is happening, especially as a contradiction, especially as a crisis born of this contradiction. It's really happening really clearly for the first time in the 1840s. I mentioned the July Revolution of 1830 as the major political event that predates the 1848 revolutions. Rosa Luxemburg, a very famous late 19th and early 20th century Marxist, she talks about the rising of the weavers in Lyon in France in 1831 as the beginning of the class struggle. So the class struggle begins in 1831. So what does that mean? Especially because we know from the Communist Manifesto that class struggle can be traced all the way back to classical antiquity. It can be slave and master, plebeian and patrician. It can be journeyman versus master of the guild. It can be lord and serf. But no, in the specific way that Marx and Engels meant, and also subsequent Marxists, really class struggle refers to something much more specific, much more recent, the division and antagonism and struggle within bourgeois society between the workers and the capitalists, both of whom are members of the third estate, and both of whom are bourgeois classes. And that's the last thing that I'll say about bourgeois society and bourgeois social relations before I get into the history now. Bourgeois in French just means urban. So to be bourgeois means to be a town dweller, a city dweller, city folk, town folk, as opposed to the country folk. So traditional civilization was centered on the countryside. It was centered on the farming village. Uh, the bulk of the population was peasantry, the peasant farmers. Like 95% of the population was that. And even the upper castes, the upper classes are really the upper castes, the clergy, the priestly caste, and the aristocracy, the warrior caste, very tiny part of the population. And then the commoners who were not peasants were also a very small sliver of the population, the guildcraft artisans and the merchants. So the third estate, mostly peasants, but then also guildcraft artisans and merchants. Bourgeois society, so all of that was taking place in the countryside. So the guildcraft artisans are in the village. The priest is the village pastor. The aristocracy, the lord is the lord of the manor. It's all in the countryside. There are cities, but the cities are not centers of production. They're not centers of social reproduction. They're centers of administration. So they're centers of like religious authority and also temporal authority. So the cities are where the kings or the emperors might be, and where the church is headquartered, and has its sort of satellite headquarters. But otherwise, the center of society is really rural. In modern society, the center of society becomes urban. And what does that mean? It means not just a huge population explosion in the cities, which happens. So a movement of population from the countryside to the cities, and also provincial towns, not just the major cities, but provincial towns. So the emergence of urban life, but also production and social reproduction tend to be centered on the activity going on in the modern cities. So this is usually dated to the Renaissance because the Renaissance, the emergence of the free city-states of Europe. The Southern Renaissance, the Italian city-states, and the Northern Renaissance, the Hanseatic League. Right, so the Renaissance is the emergence of bourgeois society. It's the emergence of these free city-states that are free in the sense of they're freeing themselves from the feudal aristocratic order and the pattern of life in the countryside. And they usually have a more or less fraught relationship with traditional religious authorities, and then they tend to develop a political relationship with the kings, then an alliance between themselves and the kings against the aristocracy, and also against the church, or trying to establish some independence from the in Western Europe from the Roman Church, from the Catholic Church. So that social transformation from rural to bourgeois society had been going on for hundreds of years by the time of the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution is a very late development in terms of bourgeois society. I mentioned the alliance between the bourgeoisie, and bourgeoisie at that time meant town dwellers. So the workers were part of the bourgeoisie because they're urban, they're not peasants. And also it's transformation of the guilds and guildcraft. There's more of a modern working class that's free of the traditional guild structure, and even the guilds themselves are transformed in this period. The absolutist monarchies, the absolutist state, is actually a modern bourgeois phenomenon. So when the king separates himself from the aristocracy and establishes kind of dominance over all of society, the absolute monarchy, which usually involves some independence from the church as well. So we know from Henry VIII, even without the impact of the radical Protestantism, just the establishment of an independent Catholic Church, basically the Anglican Church, That's a bourgeois phenomenon. That's a phenomenon of the modern bourgeois era. So these things have been going on for hundreds of years before the industrial era. And one of the curiosities of the late bourgeois era and early industrial era is that the French Revolution, for example, 1789 French Revolution, is happening in the midst of this, in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. So it's a kind of a late bourgeois revolution. The earlier bourgeois revolutions were the Dutch Revolt. You could also say the Protestant Reformation in general is a kind of massive bourgeois revolution. The English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution in England, the thinker of which is John Locke, primary thinker of which is John Locke. And then, of course, the American Revolution as an extension and deepening of the English Revolution. And then its connection directly. They used to call it called the Atlantic Revolution. The American and French revolutions are very much tied. They share a lot of the same personnel, like Lafayette and Thomas Jefferson, for example, are protagonists in both the American and French Revolution. These are late bourgeois revolutions. The July Revolution in France in 1830 is considered the last successful bourgeois revolution. So what does that mean? Well, it's the last successful, not defeated, transformative, emancipatory bourgeois revolution or revolution in the bourgeois era that is, doesn't have the same problems that start to manifest in the 1848 revolutions and have characterized the problems of all modern revolutions ever since then. In 1830, what the French got out of the July Revolution is what they aimed for in 1789. So they aimed in 1789 to get a constitutional monarchy. They basically wanted what the English had. The French Enlightenment, the Enlightenment philosophers, and also the French revolutionaries of 1789, coming out of that Enlightenment background, they were considered Anglophiles, meaning they were trying to follow the lead of England and trying to bring what the English Revolution had achieved to France. So they aimed for that in 1789. They got something far more radical. They didn't get a constitutional monarchy, they got a republic, basically due to the fact that Louis XVI wouldn't play along with the constitutional monarchy. So there was a kind of radicalism that came out of the French Revolution. But then the Sturm und Drang of the French Revolution, the Jacobin terror, the fall of the Jacobins, the chaos of the Directory, the Consulate, and then finally the Empire with Napoleon Bonaparte. After all of that and the Restoration, there was a Restoration finally in 1815, starting in 1814, but Napoleon makes his comeback for 100 days in 1815. They finally achieve in 1830 what they initially aimed for, which was a constitutional monarchy, the July monarchy. In some ways, it mirrored the events of the English Revolution of the 17th century. So the English Civil War was far more radical, and then it was capped off. It was institutionalized in its success with the Glorious Revolution in 1688, 1689. And it's not accidental. It's not merely fortuitous that the French Revolution marks the centenary of the English Glorious Revolution. So 1830, you get the July monarchy, you get Louis Philippe Orléans. He comes in from another wing of the family, the cadet branch of the royal family. And he's considered the citizen king, the bourgeois king. So you have really a consolidated modern constitutional monarchical state in bourgeois society in the industrial era in the 1830s. So you get a lot of the social dislocations of industrialization. I mentioned the rising of the weavers in Lyon as the beginning of the class struggle. We also associate that time with the Luddites. The workers are smashing machines because they see the machines as threatening themselves, threatening their employment, threatening their livelihood. So again, the political and social effects, the beginning of the class struggle, is a function of the Industrial Revolution and the threat that it represents to the working class. So the working class is forced by industrialization to make certain demands on society. The modern proletariat as the creation of industrial production, a working class beset by chronic systemic structural unemployment. Right, that's what defines the proletariat. Marx used this term, and he wasn't the first to use it. There were other socialists who also used the term proletariat, and other observers of society, other social theorists who describe the proletariat. It's a term from ancient Rome, and it refers to citizens without property. So in ancient Rome, it's a tribal republic, meaning if you're tribally Roman, then you're part of the republic. But the development of Roman civilization was such that eventually the tribal Romans, who were the ruling class and who basically represented the kind of warrior caste of the tribe that had conquered the other Italian peoples, eventually Roman civilization developed to such a point where to be tribally Roman, you would not necessarily get property. So property was the fruit of conquest. It was allotted to people as a function of the conquests by the Romans of other people. So people were tribally Roman, but without property. And yet they had full rights as citizens. They could vote, for example. So they were a legally recognized class, the proletari. They were people without property and yet still citizens. I mentioned earlier from the manifesto, plebeian and patrician. So basically the propertied Romans were the patricians, the old families, and the propertyless or small property holders, the sort of lower ranks of Roman society, were the plebeians, and the proletari were, the mass of Roman citizens without property. So they resuscitate this term in the modern era to describe the modern working class. So modern society is not tribal in the way that ancient democracy, ancient republics were. It's bourgeois, and yet it has a different kind of notion of property. So I mentioned John Locke out of the Glorious Revolution in England. John Locke, who said property is not the result of physical possession, physical seizure, conquest, but property rights are based on labor. So basically land belongs to the farmers. It doesn't belong to the aristocracy. So the aristocracy, who were descended from the German tribes that conquered Europe in the Great Migration of Peoples at the end of the Roman Empire, the Anglo-Saxons who conquered England, who conquered Britain and made it England, the Franks who conquered Gaul and made it into France. They had their titles, their property, based on conquest. John Locke formulated the idea that no, property shouldn't be based on property right should not be based on might. It shouldn't be based on seizure through force. It should be based on labor. So rather than the baron, having title to the land as his property and also title to the peasants who farmed it as his property, no, the land belonged to the peasants who farmed it. So it's a bourgeois conception of property. Again, a bourgeois conception of social relations. So modern social relations are relations with each other, relations between people, relations to nature, such as the land, and the self-relation are not based on a divine great chain of being in which God has created us and put us in our place in the universe? No, not those religious social relations, not a religious cosmology with its social relations, with its way of making sense of the way people relate to each other, to nature, and to themselves. Rather, it's labor is the modern social relation, the bourgeois social relation. So we relate to each other as collaborators, as fellow laborers in social cooperation. We relate to nature as the material and the thing that we work on and work up through our labor. And we relate to ourselves in terms of our laboring capacities. So we are creative, productive individuals as laborers. So that conception, of bourgeois right, our rights as citizens and as human beings is based on that bourgeois right, the right to self-ownership, right? So we relate to ourselves as our own property. We relate to others as collaborators and also as fellow property owners in the property of our labor and its products. And we relate to nature, again, through this labor relation. So what does it mean to say that bourgeois society produces a class of people who are bourgeois, but who are propertyless? How is that possible? Because after all, we have property in ourselves, we have property in our own bodies, in our own capacities. And so wouldn't that be an inalienable property? Wouldn't our labor and the social relations of our labor be something that is inalienable as a social right? Well, with the Industrial Revolution, with industrial capitalism, it's precisely that we become alienated from. So Marx famously described in the 1844 manuscripts the four dimensions of alienation. He said modern capitalism is characterized by alienation between people, alienation from nature, alienation from ourselves and our own capacities and faculties, and alienation from our own production, from our own productive activity and its products and its results. Right. So again, a modern society produces an alienated working class, modern bourgeois society, a society based on the social relations of labor. In the 1789 revolution, in the 1789 French Revolution, the most famous, well-read and influential pamphlet in that revolution is written by the Abbé Sieyès. It's called What is the Third Estate? And he says, the third estate is defined unlike the first and second estate. The first estate is the priestly caste who pray. The second estate, the warrior caste, the aristocracy, they fight. The third estate works. And he says, up till now, the third estate has been nothing. But from now on, the third estate will be everything. And the first estate and the second estate will have to redefine its roles as a productive contribution to society. So the priestly caste can redefine its role. They can become educators and philosophers. And the second estate, the aristocracy with their honor code of the warrior caste, they can be transformed into diplomats and politicians, as well as warriors. But they basically are going to do a job, right? They're not going to have any special caste, divinely ordained place in the universe. They're only going to justify their existence insofar as they perform a role like everyone else, that they do their jobs. And if they're not capable of redescribing their role in society in this way, then they will be kicked out. They'll be banished from society. He says if the aristocrats are unwilling to understand the true role they play, he says they can go back to the Franconian forests from whence they came. They can go back to Germany. Right. So again, this is the consciousness of bourgeois society. It's the consciousness of the bourgeois revolution. But that goes into crisis with the industrial era. The ideals, the bourgeois ideals of all equal with equal rights, inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from the American Revolution, from the Declaration of Independence, and the ideals, the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity from the French Revolution. All of these prove to be inadequate to the new social conditions of industrial production. In other words, ostensibly, we still live in the society of equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as our inalienable rights. We still live in the society that values, above all, liberty, equality, and fraternity, solidarity. And yet, the Industrial Revolution makes a mockery and undermines and contradicts all of those values in practice. And so that's the modern proletariat is the phenomenal manifestation, it's the embodiment of this contradiction and crisis in bourgeois society that comes with industrial capitalism. And it's what contemporaries in the 1840s said posed the social question. So the social question is, what kind of society are we living in where we have a huge mass of people who have been proletarianized in this way, right? Who formally have rights, but substantially have lost their rights because they've lost their property rights, their rights as laborers, as participants in society. They've been reduced from citizens and from human beings, the rights of human being and citizen, the Declaration of the Rights of Human Being and Citizen in the French Revolution. They've been reduced as citizens and as human beings in industrial conditions of labor. They've been brutalized, animalized. They've been turned into machines. They've been turned into mere appendages of the machine. Right? Their bourgeois rights have been stripped from them in practice. Nobody intended it, and yet it happened. So this presents the social question. What are we going to do about this? Socialism, modern socialism, socialism as it developed up until the 1840s, was an attempt to respond to this. To say, what kind of society do we need that could overcome this problem of, or this contradiction between the industrial forces of production and the bourgeois social relations of production. So again, Marx and Engels are arriving on the scene. All of this is fully in train, been developing for decades. And with the crisis of the 1840s, with the hungry 1840s, it seems obvious that there's going to be a revolution. There's going to be a revolution really throughout Europe, perhaps even in England. In some ways, the revolution born of the industrial era breaks out earlier in England with the Chartist movement and with things like the Peterloo Massacre. You get this kind of political upheaval already going on in England, a little bit ahead of the curve, because after all, the Industrial Revolution began in England and only spread to the continent in the wake of the French Revolution. Comes a little bit later in the continent. But not just Marx and Engels, but really everyone is anticipating the revolution that ends up breaking out in 1848. And it breaks out first in France, but then quickly spreads. So it breaks out in February of 1848 in France, and it breaks out later in 1848 and into 1849 in Germany. It's also seen elsewhere, such as Vienna and other parts of Europe. So it's known at the time the spring of the nations. So the 1848 revolutions are known as the spring of the peoples or the spring of the nations. And it's where we get the term for the Arab Spring, the recent events in 2011, the Arab Spring. But this term was used before that. The Prague Spring in 1968. Really, any popular uprising has been called the spring of a people and their rise up. So that's first described in the events of the 1848 revolutions, the spring of the peoples. In Germany, but also other places, I mentioned Vienna and also Italy, what's associated with the revolutions of 1848 are movements of national unification. So the UK, Britain, and France, through their revolutions, had already achieved a kind of national unification that was lacking elsewhere in Europe. So that's a large component of, and what's the need of that kind of national unification? Again, the needs of modern bourgeois society. However, now complicated by the social question presented by the modern proletariat. So again, the idea that we need more than just a constitutional monarchy, what they had in the UK. In some ways, the American system, the US Constitution, is a kind of constitutional monarchy. The presidential system, the president is an elected monarch. And again, the French Revolution really aimed at a constitutional monarchy. It got something more radical. It got a democratic republic. In the United States, you get what Dick Howard, the modern political theorist and scholar of Rosa Luxemburg in the Frankfurt School, he calls the French tradition democratic republicanism. In the United States, he calls it republican democracy. All right, so it's a constitutional republic that also has democracy as the consent of the governed, if you know that expression. But something more radical seems to be required in the 19th century under industrial conditions. Universal suffrage, at least universal manhood suffrage, for all men, regardless of property requirements. The Chartist movement I mentioned in England demanding this. Also in the United States. While the United States does not industrialize fully until after the Civil War, until after the abolition of slavery, of course, the United States is affected by the Industrial Revolution in Europe, in England, and in continental Europe. And you see the effects of that in Andrew Jackson's reforms, Jacksonian democracy. And the first really modern political party in US history, and that's the Democratic Party. That's again in the industrial era. Mass democracy has its birth at this time. So the more radical Democrats, and you'll know from the Communist Manifesto that Marx and Engels say, the communists do not form a party of their own, but only form the left wing of the Democratic Party, small d Democratic Party, namely the party of democracy in the revolution. He changed his mind about that later, but we'll get to that, about forming a separate party. But at first, he and Engels are saying, no, we're just the left wing of the democratic revolution. So the industrial era seems to bring with it a new need for democracy, for universal suffrage democracy, for mass democracy. What rights do people have if they're precarious in their employment, if they can't establish their rights through civil society, as workers in civil society? Well, the very least that they can have is the right to vote. So rather than their social and political interests being represented by their employers, by the property classes, because of the uncertainty of labor and because of chronic or at least seasonal unemployment, the working class, the mass of people, require something new politically. They require democracy in a new way. So the way Marxists understand this is that the demand for democracy, the need for democracy, the necessity of democracy is actually a new historical necessity in the 19th century. So freedom can't be achieved simply through civil society, through the kind of organic social relations of civil society, but must enter the political domain of the state. So that's where the demand for universal suffrage comes from. It's a symptom, it's a phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution and of the proletarianization of labor. And also demand on the state to do something about the social conditions of the modern industrialized working class. So a lot of what we associate with the 20th century, the welfare state, government jobs programs, unemployment benefits, unemployment insurance, we associate that here in the United States with the New Deal, with the 1930s, with FDR, with the Great Depression. In fact, all of this began in the 1840s. It begins with the 1848 revolution in France, where the provisional government, they have a socialist minister of labor, Louis Blanc, and they have a project called the National Workshops to deal with the problem of unemployment and the misery of the 1840s, the hungry 1840s. The government is going to put people to work in public works projects where private industry can't employ them because of the commercial crisis. As it turns out, they have to cancel that program because they're unable to raise the money for it to finance it through taxes and also through sovereign debt, through floating bonds on the international finance market. So basically, the rich people in France are like, hell no, we're not paying for that. And also the rich people around the world, City of London, they're like, yeah, we can't really underwrite this loan that the French are trying to float on the international bond market. So they have to cancel the program. And when they cancel the program, the working class of Paris rises up. And that's the crisis of the 1848 revolution in France in June of 1848. So they rise up to try to overthrow the provisional government and try to restore the National Workshop program, try to seize control of the state, and they're suppressed in a very violent way. So thousands are killed and many more thousands are deported. They're deported to the colonies. So to Algeria and other colonies. The general who leads that massacre of the working class in France in June of 1848, Cavaignac, he becomes the candidate, the liberal candidate for president in the election of December 1848. So the first presidential election of the Second Republic. I mentioned that there was a republic in the original French Revolution. Now there's what's known as the Second Republic. After they overthrow the July monarchy, the constitutional monarchy, they establish the Second Republic. And the first election for the presidency and also for the full National Assembly is in December of 1848. And the liberal candidate is Cavaignac. He's the general who massacred the workers of June of 1848. Running against him is the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Louis Bonaparte. So who is Louis Bonaparte? So he is a Bohemian radical. He's in with the Bohemian intellectual scene, the cultural and political radical scene. He's living in exile from France because he's too much of a political radical. He's actually living in London for a while. He's influenced by the utopian socialists. So for a time, he's a member of the Saint-Simonian Society of Utopian Socialists. And his friends, his comrades, people that he brings into office with him later. So he's a kind of Saint-Simonian socialist nationalist, but a kind of a political adventurer, a kind of bohemian radical. He runs for president in this election of December of 1848, and it shocks everyone when he wins the election. He wins the election on the basis of the working class that's embittered by the suppression of the uprising of June 1848. And he's also elected with a strong representation of the vote of the peasantry. Because to the peasantry, he represents the memory of Napoleon Bonaparte. So a kind of plebeian, from below, patriotic nationalism. And it's from Louis Bonaparte that we get a term in political science called Bonapartism. But the story of that is a little bit more complicated. So he serves one term as president of the Second Republic. He can't run for re-election because they have a one-term limit in the Second Republic. And so at the end of his first term, he has a coup d'etat and overthrows the Second Republic and establishes a second empire. And he crowns himself Napoleon III. And he rules for 20 years until the Franco-Prussian War deposes him. The Germans arrest him on the battlefield when the French armies are defeated in the Franco-Prussian War. But he's affirmed in his coup d'etat by plebiscite. So he has a plebiscite. He says, people, do you approve of my coup d'etat? And they're overwhelmingly said yes. And he renews the empire 10 years later in more of a rigged election the second time around. But I think he's affirmed the first time like 80 something percent and the second time like 90 something percent in the plebiscites that ratify the Second Empire. And he engages in a radical restructuring reform of France that we know from the architecture of France. The boulevards, the great boulevards of France, of Paris, of the remade city of Paris, by Baron Haussmann, was one of his cronies. And he was also associated other things like financial reform, also influenced by Credit Mobilier, influenced by and implemented by Saint-Simonian socialists. So he has a kind of a quasi-socialistic regime of industrial modernization and development in France. And it's from this phenomenon that we get Bonapartism, namely a dictatorship that has a great deal of popular authority and that rests on serving the lower classes. Marx famously wrote about this in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And one of his lines there is, bourgeois fanatics for law and order are shot down on their balconies in the name of law and order. So when the coup d'etat happens, what Louis Bonaparte does, he gives rifles to the workers and he sends them into the bourgeois neighborhoods and says, arrest my enemies. He gets popular support for that because during the Second Republic, during that first term of his presidency, he and his faction in the assembly were undermined by others, by the liberals, with reforms to voting rules. Basically, they try to cut down the eligibility to vote of the peasants and the workers by establishing not property requirements, but residency requirements. So residency requirements which disadvantage the proletarianized working class and also the rural, the agricultural proletariat, the migrant agricultural workforce get disenfranchised. And he's always fighting back against these voting reforms, and that's how he ends up being a champion of the common people against the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, the capitalists, who were trying to wrest control of the Second Republic back from him. In Germany, what happens is, and Marx and Engels directly participate, is more of a bourgeois democratic revolution along the French revolutionary lines of the earlier French revolutions. Um, and you get a kind of division between Eastern and Western Germany. In terms of Western Germany, the more bourgeois part of Germany, the more liberal and more democratically minded part of Germany, ultimately being suppressed by the Prussians. So Germany at this time is a collection of princely states, small kingdoms, but it's a German federation or confederation, and the leadership there is exercised by Prussia, but it's not yet the Prussian Empire. The Prussian Empire is one of the results of the Revolution of 1848. And also long term becomes really the result of two events: the 1848 revolution and also the victory of the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71. So it's between these years and those decades that you get the consolidation and unification of Germany and the establishment of the Prussian Empire that we know from the end of the 1800s. The main political figure in Germany who emerges out of this process is Otto von Bismarck. So he's a Prussian aristocrat who serves as Chancellor of Prussia, and who really is responsible for the policies. So what I'll say about that is that originally the Germans, the German bourgeoisie, the capitalists, and the workers rise up together. But in the course of events, they become divided. And basically the capitalists and the upper classes, the upper echelons of the bourgeoisie, go along with the repression of the revolution by the Prussian authorities. So they kind of turn against the working class in order to limit the revolution, because they see that things are getting out of their control, that the working class is making demands that they themselves feel that they can't go along with. And so they end up accepting being repressed in their aspirations, in their liberal and democratic aspirations, out of class interests against the working class. So they end up betraying the revolution. At least this is the way Marx and Engels see it. But also, this is the conventional historiography, that the revolution breaks down in Germany through a division of the working class from the capitalist bourgeoisie, and the Prussians take advantage of that to maintain the authority of the traditional aristocratic ruling class. So I mentioned Bismarck. So Bismarck has a famous phrase, a famous expression. It says that the lesson of 1848, not just in Germany, but in France as well, and elsewhere, the lesson of the revolutions of 1848 was that not popular assemblies and fine speeches will decide the course of events, but iron and blood will decide the course of events. Okay. So that's why Bismarck is known as the Iron Chancellor, and it's the famous blood and iron speech that he gives. And what I like to point out is that Marx and Engels didn't necessarily disagree with that conclusion by Bismarck. So Bismarck is a kind of he's a kind of a modern statesman. He's like a Cardinal Richelieu kind of crafty guy. Maybe he's like a Metternich kind of figure. He's a modern political statesman. And his desire to maintain the authority of the traditional ruling classes is as much a political calculus as it is simply a kind of narrow personal class interest. Another famous phrase of Bismarck's is that he said, "I've been accused of being a liberal. I've been accused of being a reactionary. I've been accused of being a Democrat. I've been accused of being a monarchist. I've been accused of being a socialist. He says, I'm none of those things, or maybe I'm all of those things, because all that I do is seek to reach for the hem of God's garments as he passes. Meaning, he said, I just did what was necessary. And sometimes that was liberal, sometimes it was democratic, sometimes it was monarchical, sometimes it was socialistic. But I just did what was necessary. Marx and Engels called this Bonapartism in Germany. So they regarded Bismarck as a German Bonapartist, meaning you could see it as opportunism, as political opportunism, or you could see it as an expression of political necessity. And of course, that's what Marx and Engels thought. They thought that Bonapartism, whether in the form of Louis Bonaparte or Otto von Bismarck, was an expression of historical, social, political necessity in the era of capitalism. They also looked at other figures, for instance, in England. They called the kind of struggles within the Liberal Party, within the Whigs and then the Liberal Party, the emergence of the Liberal Party in the UK, by people like Gladstone, and also the Tory Benjamin Disraeli. They called it parliamentary Bonapartism. So they called the machinations of the Liberal and Tory governments of the mid and late 19th century in the UK parliamentary Bonapartism, meaning it's a Bonapartist state, even though it has to be cobbled together through parliamentary majorities, but it's still a Bonapartist state. It has to do with the way they understood the role of the state in capitalism. In other words, that capitalism gives a new role, a new necessity to the state. It's to manage the social crisis of capitalism, to try to address the social question of the proletarianization of bourgeois society. Bismarck, you guys might know, is associated with the successful implementation as opposed to the abortive implementation in the French Revolution of 1848, the successful implementation of social welfare state policies. National retirement funds and unemployment insurance, things like that, which become a model, by the way. Bismarck's reforms become a model for capitalist reformers throughout the world. So it's a model for Fabianism, which is the founding ideology of the British Labour Party. It's also inspirational for people like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson in the United States. The German social welfare state reforms implemented by Bismarck. State socialism. State socialism is what Marx and Engels called it, pejoratively. State socialism. Ultimately, Marx and Engels, they changed their perspective, as I mentioned, on the 1848 revolutions, because they went into it with the Communist Manifesto saying the working class goes into the revolution as the left wing of the Democratic Party, the Democratic Revolution. Communists, representing this new proletarianized working class, don't form a party of their own, right? But join the broader Democratic movement and Democratic Party, small p, small d, Democratic Party. After the revolution, after the failure of the revolutions in France and Germany, and after the emergence of Bonapartism with people like Louis Bonaparte and Otto von Bismarck, now their perspective is rather that the working class has to organize independently of the bourgeoisie, independently of the petty bourgeoisie, independently of bourgeois democracy, and independently of petty bourgeois democracy. They have to form a party of their own, and they have to form an independent social movement and social organizations of their own, because the only way the revolution is going to be successful, they think, after 1848, after the events and results of 1848. I think the lesson of 1848 is that the only way the revolution can succeed as a modern democratic revolution, not even talking about socialism, but as a modern democratic revolution that's able to deal with the modern needs of democracy, the social question, the proletariat, will be to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. So they basically say the result of modern social and political movements and modern social and political revolutions will either be a dictatorship in the name of capital, a Bonapartist dictatorship, a dictatorship of the capitalist state, or the dictatorship of the proletariat, by which they meant the working class becoming the ruling class and taking over the governance of society. And to do that, they have to be organized. They have to be sufficiently organized to replace the capitalist state. The working class has to, before the revolution, be organized in the way that they were not sufficiently organized before the revolutions of 1848. So now they have to build up their own civil, social, and political organization independently so that they can take over the state next time there's a crisis. And that's what they meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat. And they also thought that this needed to be done internationally, that the working class had to organize itself internationally so that a country will not be isolated as a revolutionary country and face the whole rest of the world ganging up on it. So the dictatorship of the proletariat, to be successful, will have to encompass some strong plurality at least, or hopefully majority of the core capitalist countries. So at that time, of course, it would have been England and France would have had to, the working class would have had to take power in England and France in order to be able to hold on and be able to establish this dictatorship of the proletariat and address the social question of capitalism, address this contradiction, this mismatch between bourgeois social relations and the industrial forces of production. Because otherwise, the capitalist state will try to manage the crisis in its own way, but will fail to do so. In other words, we'll just keep capitalism going. In other words, we'll just maintain, we'll try to take measures, but ultimately fail at overcoming the contradiction of industrial forces and bourgeois social relations of production. Right. So in many respects, 1848 is the founding moment of Marxism, because Marxism, Marx and Engels having their own unique, specific political perspective, different from other socialist and communist currents, other tendencies. That's less clear before the 1848 revolutions. For them, it's clarified coming out of the 1848 revolutions. And Marx himself said his only original contribution is in grasping the historical necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Even the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat was not original to Marx. It was actually Auguste Blanqui, a French socialist, a French radical, who came up with the idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat, but that was meant to be an emergency measure. That was meant to be the smashing of the capitalist state in order to just allow like a kind of a coup d'etat putsch that would then just allow the people to more organically reorganize society. Whereas Marx understood the dictatorship of the proletariat to be a transitional state that takes over the contradiction of capitalism and creates the political conditions for the working class working through and working beyond the contradiction of capitalism, which he thought would take a generation. That there could only be a transition from capitalism to communism through the dictatorship of the proletariat, in which the state would not be abolished, like the anarchists thought, but would only wither away as the contradiction of capitalism is gradually overcome. So that's the unique perspective of Marxism, and it's born of the what Marx and Engels took to be the lesson of the revolutions of 1848 and their failure, their impasse and their failure. All right, so again, subjectively and objectively, economically and politically, the crisis of the modern capitalist world came into view for the first time in the 1840s and in the events of the 1848 revolutions. And in many respects, we've had many political upheavals in the era of capitalism since 1848, but they tend to follow the same pattern. Namely, a radical democratic upsurge followed by a state dictatorship that manages to try to, kind of navigates, tries to manage the crisis of capitalism and ends up maintaining capitalism, but creating new problems as a result, because of course the idea is that only the working class itself can overcome capitalism. That some technocratic state, kind of bureaucratic management, can't actually abolish the contradiction of bourgeois right, bourgeois social relations, and industrial forces of production. That if that doesn't happen at a popular level through a great deal of civil, social, as well as political participation, and again, not in an isolated country, even in one advanced capitalist country, that actually you can't overcome capitalism. You can only reproduce it. You can only kind of reconfigure it, but you can't actually overcome it. My last statement will be about how Leon Trotsky, but also Frankfurt School critical theory, understood Stalinism in the Soviet Union as Bonapartist. They also understood other things in these terms. They understood fascism, whether Mussolini fascism or Hitler fascism, as a kind of extreme Bonapartism. And they understood the FDR New Deal as a kind of a soft Bonapartism, meaning a kind of a state capitalism, but because of the immense resources of the United States, didn't have to be done quite as brutally as in other places like Russia and Germany and Italy. Italy less brutal than Germany, but Germany quite brutally, and in Russia very brutally, in fact. Trying to deal with the emergence of a modern bourgeois society and in under conditions of industrial production, but with a terribly poor and largely peasant country. And of course, China later reproduced some similar phenomena that the Soviet Union also went through. Okay, I think that's what I have on the significance of the 1848 revolutions and history of modern socialism and Marxism.